Tulalip tribal member Andrew Gobin joins us on today's Hibulb Conversations, sharing his background, his treaty rights office role, and the importance of what the 1855 Point Elliot Treaty means to Tulalip. Hi, and welcome to Hibulb Conversations. I'm Mytyl Hernadez, and today we're here with Andrew Gobin. Welcome, Andrew. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah. I'd love to start by getting to know more about you, your family, and your background. Will you tell us who your parents are?
My father's Glenn Gobin, which many people know. He's been involved in the community for a long time and was on and off tribal council for a number of years. And he had his own business and, in construction and excavating, and had a lot to do with sort of the building and development on the reservation. And my mom, she ran the business with him for a number of years. Her name's Karen Gobin. She grew up in Marysville as well, and now she works for the tribe in the finance department.
And who are your grandparents?
My mom's parents are Harry and Marilyn Martin. They lived in town, but they often came out and participated in community things. And my father's parents are Bernie and Dolores Gobin. And
what about siblings?
I have 3 siblings. My oldest sibling is Kendra Gobin. She works at the resort. My brother is Nick Gobin, and he used to work for the tribe. He was one of the owner's reps for Quilceda Village, and then he later went and started his own construction business. And my other sister is Cecilia Gobin, and she works down for the Northwest Indian Fish Commission.
And where were you born and raised?
I was born in Everett, Washington, but raised here on the reservation. I actually live now in that same house and am raising my own family there.
That's amazing. Where'd you go to school?
In Marysville, and on the reservation, I should say. My first schooling was actually at the Tulalip Montessori, and I went there until Quilceda Elementary opened, and then I started there in 2nd grade. And then I went to school in town. I kind of followed small communities. So from the Montessori, at Quill, the program was the co-op program, and so it was still very small. Parents were very involved, very community-based. From there, I went to 10th Street, which was a very small school. Again, back when it was on 10th Street, not where it is now. And then from there, I went to Arts and Tech.
So what did you end up doing after high school?
Well, I applied to several schools. I actually got into every school I applied to.
Congratulations.
Thank you. But I ended up at University of Washington. I was looking at a few different programs. At the time, I was more interested in hotel management, and so I was looking at Wazoo. That was probably my top choice. But a number of people had come and sort of expressed that, they would have hoped I would stay closer. And so I ended up going to University of Washington. My sister was also at University of Washington, as well as my cousin, and the 3 of us were very close. And so it was not difficult to change gears and move that direction. Originally, I wanted to go into business, but my first class was American Indians and the Law, which it was a 300 level class. So
right off the gate.
Right out of the gate. And I'll never forget the professor, Alexandra Harmon. She pulled me aside after the first week and wanted to know, okay, you're a freshman. What are you doing in this class? But I did well. And so I sort of fell naturally into something that I was good at, and I followed that.
Yeah. So what did you end up majoring in?
I finished college with a degree in American Indian Studies and Anthropology, and a minor in Archaeology.
Okay, far from hotels.
Yes, very far.
And you speak other languages?
I do. In high school, I took 3 years of French. Funny story, I used to end up using that quite a bit. Through college, I worked at the hotel, and for whatever reason, there was a lot of French people coming either from Canada or other places, and I actually used it a lot. I was surprised. And then in college, I learned Italian. I took 2 years of college-level Italian, and I lived in Italy for 6 months, and so had a immersive experience. I lived with a family in the south who spoke virtually no English, and so my Italian is interesting in that regard because there's a lot of dialectical influence from the south, and so it's different than some of the Italian people are used to hearing. I also speak our native language. I was a teacher in that for some time after college, and I also speak a little bit of Spanish and German.
And how were you inspired to learn so many languages?
I don't know.
Linguist at heart?
Languages come easy to me.
Yeah.
I look at them, it's easy for me to break down structures and then learn the vocabulary and plug it in. It's very systematic, I guess, in that regard. I'm not entirely sure how or why I'm good at that. I like to think that music had something to do with it. I was classically trained in piano from 4 to 18. And within that time span, I also picked up guitar and tenor sax and a number of other instruments along the way. And so music sometimes I think was the first language that sort of, built that in my own mind, breaking down other languages and being able to put them back together.
Yeah, that's beautiful. What did you do after college?
After college, I had left the hotel and I needed a job, and I started working for the tribe's newspaper. I was a journalist, and from there I was approached by the Everett Herald, and so I worked for the Everett Herald for a time. And unfortunately, shortly after I was hired, they were going to be downsizing, and so I was needing to look for another job again, and that's where the position at Language opened up.
Okay.
And so that's where I started really putting more of my degree to work in the research aspect of it, and sort of the context, the cultural context that comes with language. And then not just my degree, but also my own experience living here, growing up here. And after that, I moved into the rediscovery program and took more of a leadership role in the canoe family and taking care of the canoes. I still take care of the canoes, try to keep that going for our community. And after rediscovery, I moved into the Treaty Rights Office, which is where I work now as a Treaty Rights Policy Analyst.
I heard that you've recently been married.
Yes, I got married in September to Carly Blatchford. Together we have a total of 3 children and 1 on the way.
And tell me about your wedding.
So last year we had attended a potlatch wedding, a traditional type wedding. And as we looked at, what we might want for ourselves, we decided that we wanted to make that part of our life, and it was important to us to carry that part of our traditions forward. And so we started preparing and gathering things together, and talking to different people about what this would look like, what we should do. And part of our traditions, right, in our potlatching is giving things away. And so, that started last year. We had our sockeye run up in the islands, and so my family and I, we fished on my dad's fishing boat, and some of that fish I got to take and bring home and can. And so we gave away fresh canned sockeye. I had my cousin smoke some of it. and so then I also canned smoked sockeye.
My favorite.
Carly and I had also worked in other ways to gather huckleberry, and so we made huckleberry jam and canned that and gave that away. And then we had other items as well. Some of it purchased, some of it we had made. Some of it was a combination of things. Little personal touches, like I really like different kinds of tea, for example. And so I had gone and bought some of the teas that I like, and we made little tea tins of tea. You know, we wanted people to have something that they could enjoy, not just like some store-bought thing that's just going to go in a drawer.
Personal. Yeah, I love that.
And so, you know, people still come up and they say how moving of a ceremony it was, and you know, we tried to keep it very humble and traditional, and part of that also was that our vows, we said our vows in the language. We worked with my cousin to make sure we were going to say things correctly. My cousin Natasha Gobin, who she also officiated our wedding, at least the vow portion. Yeah. And so, you know, it was very complete in that regard, I guess, being that she was one of my language teachers and also working with her at the language department, and being that she is family. You know, it was nice to be able to include all of those aspects as we took these steps together, joining in marriage.
Yeah. Tell me about the kids.
My oldest son is Elias. He's 5 years old. Okay. He's in kindergarten now. The second oldest is Harlan. He's 3. He's about to be 4. He goes down to the Montessori. Elias also attended the Montessori. Stolza is our third. He is 11 months old. He's about to be a year old. And we gave him a Lashutsi name for a name. At the time, we were feeling very, we wanted to reclaim culture in our home and in our children's lives. And so giving him a Lashutsi name, not necessarily an Indian name in the sense that we have Indian names, but a Lashutsi name that would hold that place, you know, for him. It means moose, and at first, you know, it was just there, but it's kind of funny because he's growing into a bit of a moose. And we are expecting a 4th boy. Okay. Due in February.
It's amazing. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for sharing all about your life. We'll take a quick break, and we'll be back with more Hibulb Conversations. Welcome to the Hibulb Cultural Center and Natural History Preserve, where you'll discover the journey of the Tulalip tribes. Our interactive displays introduce you to the legacy of the Tulalip people told in our words and voices. A journey for all to experience. Welcome back to Hibulb Conversations. Today we're here with Andrew Gobin. Welcome back, Andrew.
Certainly.
Before we talk about your work, can we talk a little bit about the 1855 Point Elliot Treaty?
So the 1855 Treaty of Point Elliot, of course, signed at Mukilteo by a number of tribes, but for Tulalip, you know, this included the Snohomish, the Snoqualmie, and Skykomish, to whom Tulalip is treaty successor. And the treaty, truly what it was a way for the elders at the time, the leaders at the time, to preserve those things that would ensure our existence as Indian people. And so, you know, the first part of the treaty goes through the ceding of land and some other agreements. And then we get to Article 5, which is about the right of taking fish at all usual and accustomed places, being further secured to the Indians, together with the privilege of hunting and gathering on open and unclaimed land. That's not verbatim, but that's the essence of that. It says also, we may harvest shellfish from unstaked beds. Not to get in the weeds, but that actually is also changed a little bit. And I'll talk about that once we get into sort of treaty rights management. But those rights in Article 5 are the rights that we always held. Further secured to the Indians demonstrates that it is not a grant to the tribes of these rights. And actually in the Bolt decision, Judge Bolt talks about that specifically these rights, the right of fishing in common with the citizens of the territory, which also, that's our language from Article 5, that is a grant from the tribes. And so in addition to ceding the land, we agree to share in the fish resource, which previously was wholly ours. And again, to fish in common has been interpreted to mean half of the available resource. And there's some other key language in there. In all usual and accustomed places defines the geographic area that we can fish, which has been adjudicated many times over through the Bolt decision. And the treaty goes on in several articles to form the reservation, also to make other guarantees of healthcare and education to the tribe. And so, these make up sort of the essence, but it's a key distinction of the treaty rights, that some things are treaty rights that were granted to us, but truly the treaty rights that matter to us, to our culture, that make up all of those material, tangible things of our culture, the right to fish, the right to hunt, the right to gather. And what does that mean? What does that look like? Those things always belong to us. And it's important that we argue from that standpoint. In doing this work, it's branched out into several areas, including intellectual property and genetic resources. Terry Williams and Preston Hardison took Tulalip to the Intergovernmental Committee on Traditional Knowledge and Traditional Cultural Expression and Genetic Resources. And that's a convention of the World Intellectual Property Organization, which is an institution of the United Nations. And so that takes place in Geneva. Just to give people an idea, that's how far we go to protect treaty rights and to bring them in to present time and to look to the future, because intellectual property on traditional knowledge, traditional cultural expression doesn't exist. And so as we look, to this world, this global world now that is sharing information, our art, our knowledge, our technology continues to be dispossessed and used by external entities, and we don't receive any benefit or acknowledgement of that. And that's really what that's about, is maintaining that control. And that's really what self-determination is, what sovereignty looks like, and all of those things are embodied in the treaty. And on that last point, the point of sovereignty, very simply, a treaty is an agreement between and amongst sovereigns. And so the treaty cannot grant sovereignty. The treaty, by definition, recognizes the sovereignty of the tribes by this agreement. Furthermore, as we get into sort of American law, we get into the Constitution and the supremacy. And the Supremacy Clause says that the Constitution and all treaties made therein shall be the supreme law of the land. And so as we look at the treaty and look at the rights, and we look at how this is supposed to be applicable in law, both nationally, locally, and also internationally, those are the points that we argue from. And that understanding that has kind of unraveled over time. Or maybe not unraveled, but emerged, revealed itself. unraveling is kind of a deconstructive idea, and this is something about it's become more profound. It's built on a foundation of what was here, what is ours, and what we continue to carry forward.
Has Tulalip always had treaty rights?
Yes and no. As I said in Article 5, the right of taking fish at all usual and custom places, together with the privilege of hunting on open and unclaimed land, those rights always belong to us. Traditionally, they would have been validated through ceremony, through potlatch, through weddings, through family relations. And really, that's what usual and custom places mean. As our families return to the various village sites, they returned to the places that their families had gone. Everyone didn't go to the same place. And it was through those relations that, we established and maintained our rights as Indian people. And it's hard to talk about in a Western sense, because in a Western sense, everything is property, everything is owned, everything is commercial. Everything can be bought or sold or traded, There's nothing that doesn't fall into that Western economic model. But when you look at it tribally and through relations that way, as much of it was about the harvesting, much of it also was about, politics, but also just family dynamic.
What do treaty rights mean for Tulalip?
Treaty rights for Tulalip mean the continuation of who we are as a people. Everything is a treaty right. This basket, for example, is a treaty right. The knowledge that went into making this basket is a right. The material that would have been harvested to make this basket is a right. In the treaty, it's to gather roots and berries, and roots and berries has been interpreted to be a placeholder for anything that would have been gathered. All of the cultural material that would have been gathered to sustain us as a people. When we talk about the intangible things of our culture, we're still talking about the physical things, because going out with your parents or grandparents to harvest this material, that's where your learning happens. That's where you build those relationships. You return to the places your family goes to gather these things. And so you learn those things, you learn those relationships, and they tell you the stories. Many families have songs about harvesting specific things. All of that is a treaty right. All of that is embodied in Article 5, the rights to continue to hunt, fish, and gather, and to take what we need to sustain us as a people.
Is there anything else you'd like to share with us to help us better understand treaty rights?
Yes, treaty rights created a fiduciary responsibility, a fiduciary relationship between the tribes and the United States government and its agencies. And the fiduciary relationship is often, you hear it most as a trust-trustee relationship and a trust obligation and what that means. And through the treaty, not just because we were promised education and health care, but through the treaty, the United States takes on the responsibility to essentially manage their own citizens and manage their own government in accordance not to conflict with what was guaranteed in the treaty. Whether that was something that was granted to us, like education and health care, or whether there was something that was already ours, like Article 5, or the reservation. The reservation was ours. That's why it is a reservation of land. It's what was not ceded. People often think about that and say, we're granting this land to you. No, we gave you all the land. We're keeping this 22,000 acres. For Tulalip, other reservations were also part of that. And so that relationship, that trust obligation on the United States to uphold these rights, not just of their own citizens, but they also have to defend their rights, our rights, excuse me. They must defend the treaty. They must uphold the treaty, which is really what the Bolt decision was about. The Bolt decision was U.S. v. Washington. It culminated in the 70s. I want to say in 1974 was the final decision. But the decision was built on a number of existing Supreme Court decisions. And so the Bolt decision is so named for Judge George Bolt in the Ninth Circuit. And the tribes came together to sue the state of Washington. And that's why it's called the United States versus Washington, because the United States, as our trustee, has to step up and take on that case on our behalf. And so they have a duty to uphold the treaty. And so they sued the state because the state was trying to prevent tribes from fishing. First, the state was taking all of the available catch, and then they were telling tribes not only could they not fish, but they were telling them that there was no fish for them to harvest, which was partially true because the state was taking the available harvest, and everything else, obviously, what's called escape, right, is the fish that are allowed to go upstream to spawn and preserve the resource. And so in the name of conservation, it was made that, oh no, the tribes cannot harvest. But that's not what the right is. And Billy Frank Jr. And his family in Nisqually, at their family place, really became ground zero for that. And Billy Frank really became the public figure that became the face of the Bolt decision. But many tribal leaders were involved in that. Here at Tulalip, we had Stan Jones and my grandfather, Bernie Gobin, and Ray Freiberg actually was very young at the time, but he was one of the witnesses to testify as part of the Bolt decision as well. And all these tribal leaders came together in the Bolt decision to stand up and say, this is our right. This is not, this wasn't something given to us. This is who we are. We are a fishing people. And the decision at the time affirmed the treaty rights, and Judge Bolt took it under continuing jurisdiction. And so when I said I would explain some other things later, that continuing jurisdiction has led to things like the adjudication of usual and accustomed places, which takes into account, anthropological and ethnographical information to say, yes, these tribes are known to fish in these areas. And then, under that continuing jurisdiction, we get into other things like the Rafidi decision, which was about shellfish, which means that even in the treaty it says we can harvest shellfish except from staked beds. Well, yes and no, because once you cultivate a bed, there's a model that demonstrates how much natural production will also come on top of what you're cultivating. And so the tribes also can take shellfish from staked beds, if they so chose, because you can't control how much of that is from what you've cultivated and how much of that is natural production of shellfish. And so looking at it from these ways where we hold people accountable to what was actually stated and what the actual intent is, again, that's what treaty rights is about, is looking at it very specifically about what does this mean. And then, it brings us even more current. Right now, salmon continue to be in decline, and it's not a harvest issue. A lot of information in the public right now is inaccurate in that regard. They talk about it as a harvest issue, but truly what it is a habitat issue. And so under continuing jurisdiction, we get to the culvert decision. And the culvert decision is about fish passage barriers in stream. And so as we continue to work for not only salmon harvest and management, we also continue to work for salmon recovery and conservation. And a big part of that is the habitat that supports the resource. And again, that goes back to thinking about what does a treaty right really mean. And we hear about this in the Bolt decision. It's not the right to dip your net in an empty empty stream. It is the right to harvest fish, which means there is a right to have something to harvest, which means that the habitat that protects that harvestable resource is also protected. And the same is true of all treaty rights.
Thank you so much for being here with us and sharing all of the knowledge that you have on the treaty. Really appreciate it. We'll take a quick break and we'll be back with more Hibulb Conversations. Hibulb Cultural Center Gift Shop. Discover something special and shop our unique collection of jewelry, art, home decor, apparel, books, and children's items. Choose from unique merchandise and handcrafted items with something for everyone at the Hibulb Cultural Center. Welcome back to Hibulb Conversations. We are here with Andrew Gobin. Andrew, we appreciate all of the information you're sharing with us today. We'd love to talk about your work in the Treaty Rights Office. Can you tell us when this work got started and who was involved?
Well, I'm uncertain on the dates. Okay. I know after the Bolt decision, my grandfather actually resigned from council to start the Fisheries Office and later the Natural Resources Department. And treaty rights became a part of that. At the time, Terry Williams was working in Washington, D.C., and I cannot remember what his role was that he was asked to come back for. But I do know that Stan and my grandpa went back to D.C. basically to offer him a job, ask him to come work for Tulalip. And he did. Terry came back to Tulalip, and he worked here for many years. And he did many things for natural resources and for Tulalip and for many tribes. Starting a number of things that had to do with, natural resource management. But really, natural resource management was in practice the protection of treaty rights. And when that sort of got distilled down to specifically treaty rights is where we were coming from, it started to evolve and go into those deeper conversations that we talk about. Terry is known for talking about climate change, for example. Climate change can be a treaty right. Our rights are based in this area, and as climate change shifts how this area is, it has to be acknowledged that, our rights have to be accounted for in that. And so if you're going to have an impact on climate change, you're having an impact on tribes and treaty rights, and you have to account for that. That's just one example of sort of what treaty rights does, and sort of Terry's message on all of that is, treaty rights protects the environment. We're part of that discussion, and this is how we could engage with that. And the Treaty Rights Office really was natural resources based for a long time. But again, treaty rights is many things. And through our history, Tulalip's history, we sort of got dispersed a little bit. Treaty rights was under natural resources. Government affairs was in a different department. And government affairs handled things like Indian child welfare and healthcare and education and bills coming through legislation, whether state or federally or what have you. And it wasn't until COVID actually that the strength of that was felt once more as all of this healthcare and crisis relief was coming out, that the tribes stepped up as a government, not just a people, but as sovereigns to say what was due to them, and not only it was due, but that they were capable of administering those things. And so through that arm, or through that course of events, the Treaty Rights and Government Affairs division was sort of more solidified into what it is today, and it brought government affairs down and treaty rights together to address treaty rights the way that it should be in law, in policy, and in practice. We were running into a problem where treaty rights was always the last thing. After plans were done, after projects were done, we would come and provide comment and either support or oppose something. Most often we oppose them, especially coming from external agencies, because they didn't account for our rights.
Mm-hmm.
They didn't protect our rights. And we're always working to get out ahead of that and say, we don't want to come in at the end. We want to be involved in the beginning. We want to be involved at the inception. We want to be involved at the planning and development of these things. We want to be involved at all stages so that our rights are adequately accounted for and protected. And again, that is for the people.
Yeah.
That's not just about, an action of government. We're talking about life and death of who we are as a people. And I often bring up this example. Healthcare and treaty rights are inextricably connected. The diabetes program is a good example of this because when they were focusing on traditional foods and traditional medicines and encouraging a traditional diet in our people, people were able to step away from, in part or entirely, their diabetes medication because it was so successfully managed by a traditional diet. And I think that that's probably one of the most demonstrative things that I can think of about what it means individually. Mm-hmm. Treaty rights are foods that our bodies have adapted to over millennia. To be dispossessed of that through the native experience, right? Removal, treaty signing, moving to the reservation, and all the things that our people endured, being removed from our traditional places and being dispossessed our traditional foods, I think is one of the things that is most detrimental to us as individuals. The treaty right to have these things improves our health. It improves our life every day. And again, that's just one thing, what treaty rights means and what we do and what we look for.
And why it's so important
Exactly.
for Tulalip and our people. Tell me about some of the projects you're working on.
When I was first hired, I was really focused on the Forest Service, and I got to revise and edit a brochure that Tulalip puts out about who Tulalip is, what our rights are on Forest Service land, and basically why people should care. And it turned out really well. It had a lot of positive feedback. And I was quite proud of that. From there, getting involved in other projects, like with the Washington State Department of Natural Resources, DNR, while they don't have a trust obligation, they still have the same responsibility not to impede our resources. And getting that message across to them has always been difficult. They don't always agree or acknowledge that our rights exist on their lands. Again, getting that across to them is what we do and what's important. Aside from that, I do a lot of public outreach. I also have been getting more involved with sort of the, more of the procedural aspects of treaty rights, I guess you'd say. Getting more involved in things like National Congress of American Indians, for example, which is coming up. We go and we support through those committees what the tribe's perspective should be, and represent again our treaty rights, our interests, and ensure that the messaging that we as tribes collectively are putting out is still in line with our rights and the protection of those. Aside from that, I suppose the most specific project that I'm working on now, I just took on developing a consultation policy for Tulalip. We don't have one, actually. We always consult with other people sort of on their terms. And to explain, consultation is a mechanism of the trust relationship. It is defined as something that's legally enforceable and mandated, and many presidential orders, secretarial orders, and memoranda, whatever the plural is, have been written to reiterate that fact that consultation is not discretionary. It is mandated, it is obligated. You must consult with tribes, especially in matters regarding, anything that affects their interests, to put it very broadly. And so developing a consultation policy for Tulalip about what we will accept as consultation is something that we don't currently have. We meet with the Forest Service, and we have a very good relationship with the Forest Service, which was developed through a memorandum of agreement. And it streamlined communication between Tulalip and the U.S. Forest Service, largely conducted through the Mount Baker Snoqualmie National Forest. But that's just one example. When we get into other things like Bureau of Land Management, for example, their consultation is very different. National parks, very different. Any of the healthcare issues, their consultation is very different. When you get into the state, it gets muddled even further, because they like to consult, and they forget that it's government-to-government consultation. Like, it's not consultation with a consultant.
Right.
You must meet and confer, essentially, as sovereigns. So you have to have a decision-making person from, whether it be state or federal side, and you must meet with the decision-making authority of the tribes. That is what government-to-government consultation is. You must speak to the sovereign. You must speak to the leadership. And that's something that continues to fall through the cracks, that, they will say, oh, we did consult with tribes. And we'll come back and say, no, you didn't. You spoke with staff, mm-hmm. but you did not speak with and consult with leadership.
Yeah.
And so that continues to be something that, we've struggled with. And so, in developing this, I'm excited to take that on and bring that about, so that when we have requests for consultation, we can say, this is what we expect that to look like.
Absolutely. Tell us about some of the cultural aspects of your job.
Oh, they are deep and inextricable. I really like to get out of the office and get in the field. I get to get up to the mountains, to the Huckleberry area, and then just participating in the cultural aspects of harvesting. Being afforded those opportunities, I think, is fantastic. I do get to bring my family into the office every now and then, whether at my desk or into the field, to participate in those things as well. And then as far as the cultural aspects, I was raised at a time when culture was being revitalized very aggressively. Where we are today, for example, was cultural resources, which was, housed many things, including language. And so I said before that I went to the Montessori program, which started when I was small. I started attending when it opened. And they had language as a part of that. And we had language camp, and we had classes. And my older siblings, they actually took the advanced college classes that were offered here in the classrooms at Cultural Resources. Together with the fact that, I grew up in a fishing family, and I grew up fishing on the boat, not just as a job, but understanding, we ate fish all the time. It was to provide for the house. Yep. Going hunting and having that experience with my grandfather and my cousins, spending that time, whether out for the birds that, a lot of people don't think about that. When they think about hunting, they think you're up big game, but we take a lot of birds, and, those have a significant place in our culture as well, that doesn't often get talked about. Not that it needs to, but sometimes I think people forget about that mm-hmm. there's more to hunt. There's more to harvest. And I've been fortunate to gather many of those things, to experience many of those things, to hunt many of those things, and not just that, but also start to finish, harvesting, processing, making a finished product, whether that's something like a basket or something like a food or a medicine. And through my own experience of language and learning in that way, and learning the language and the roots of the words, and how it changes as you attach prefixes and suffixes. Again, just very simply, our language is verb-based or experience-based, and I cannot remember the word for Doug fir, but depending on what you're talking about changes the word you're using, because the word for Doug fir tree ends, with the tree suffix -ots. But once it's down as a log, it changes to a word that means easy to split. Because it was easy to split dry firewood, and that's what we burned. And so, that's just one example. There are other examples of how the language, the word, the names of plants or places, they speak to what we use them for. They speak to that importance. And so just understanding that part of culture as well, and how our people engaged with different things, brings a richness and an understanding to the work I do now about why is this important. It's not just important, again, for the tangible to have this. We're talking about who we are. We're talking about the fabric of our culture. We are also talking about the essence of our culture, our identity.
And that traditional upbringing and being able to practice gathering and hunting and all of that, as well as language, has really prepared you for this position. Do you feel that way?
I do. When I worked in Rediscovery, I talked about that actually quite a bit, that my cultural learning had always... it was very experiential, and it might have been maybe a little bit more superficial, but working in Rediscovery and learning more about sort of a holistic approach to things brought a richness to that experience that was not there before. And again, everything adds to everything, right? And so that richness has only continued to inform the importance of what we do now.
What goals or projects do you want to work on as we look to the future?
As far as a goal goes, we always want to see the expansion of capacity in treaty rights and government affairs. Like I said, they're not so different as people might think. I talked about government affairs gets into Indian child welfare, for example. The ability to keep our kids in our community is hugely critical, again, to the continuation of our existence as a people. That is, by extension, a treaty right. Getting people to understand that, building that capacity so that we can operate more fully, more completely in these arenas, I think is probably one of the biggest goals that I have. Treaty rights and government affairs is quite possibly one of the most important external departments in the tribe. Because we deal with, we deal with who we are as a people, and we deal with those rights, but really what we do, we engage with all these governments, we engage with non-governmental organizations that come to the tribes, and for so long we've always been, the last line of defense, as would have been called before. Billy talks about that in the Bolt decision. The treaties are the last line of defense for the salmon. And we want to get to a point where it's the first line of defense. That's why we're in these different arenas with these different governments, with these different agencies, because we don't want to be the last line of defense. The last line of defense is sometimes I don't know how to characterize this. Sometimes it's just a discouraging place to be because everything is so bleak. But if you're out in front of it, if it's the first line of defense, you can always come back to continue to carry on that defense until you get to the last line of defense. And again, part of that importance is not just the defense, it's also the advocacy. Again, we saw that in COVID, treaty rights and government affairs being part of the higher circle, I guess, of leadership that went out to Washington, D.C., or even virtually, and talked about, you know, we're not going to fall through the cracks. We're not going to be a community that doesn't get reached by this. We're not going to be a community that doesn't get help. Because again, healthcare is a treaty right. And so that's part of the reason the vaccines came to the tribes first. That's part of the reason so much funding came to the tribes. And again, that's just the most recent example of, you know, how critical our role is for the tribe externally. Within the tribe, still an important department, but I wouldn't say that any one is more important than the other. You know, that's one of the teachings that's been given and repeated several times is not everyone does the same thing. And in its most basic form, the teaching is you don't teach everyone the same thing, so that everyone still needs each other. The same is true of tribal government. No department, no service is greater than another because everyone still needs everyone. You still need higher education to support the graduates in whatever field they choose to go, whether that's vocational or college or whatever, because they're going to come back and they're going to work in community development or the construction program or auto maintenance or these other things that support the very real things that we do day to day for community support. Or they're going to go on to, you know, these other degrees like anthropology or law or, you know, doctors or whatever. We're building a school. We need teachers. So, you know, we're gonna do all of that. And then there are the other aspects, all the services that are provided for assistance or all these things. You know, not one is any greater than the other. But I will say that treaty rights plays a role in all of that, again, because all of those things that are supported by these various departments are an extension of the sovereignty of the tribe, are an extension of those rights that we reserved, because without those rights, these other things wouldn't exist.
Thank you so much. Thank you for being here with us and sharing so much knowledge and educating us on treaty rights. I've learned a ton by sitting here with you. Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for watching Hibulb Conversations. I'm Mytyl Hernadez. Until next time.